Hola, buenas tardes. En nombre de Vision, quisiera darles a todos la bienvenida a nuestro primer webinar que estamos haciendo con Eurizon SLJ, donde tenemos a Steven Yen y Matt Jones. Esteban los va a introducir más en detalle. Este es el primer webinar de una serie de webinars que vamos a hacer de diferentes temas. Esperamos que les guste y que sea de utilidad para todos. Comentarles brevemente que con Eurizon tenemos un partnership donde tenemos a Steven que nos da research y también en proceso de lanzamiento de unos ETF que vamos a comentar durante la presentación. Los dejo con Esteban.
Thank you so much, Camila. So it's a great honor for me to introduce our good friends and partner from Eurizon SLJ. And many of you have been already following research and thought from Stephen Jen. And we really take this opportunity to discuss it with our investors and friends of Vision, many of them from Chile. We see investors from Colombia and Peru also being connected. So thank you so much for that. Stephen is founder and CIO of Eurizon SLJ, advising and managing investment for most sophisticated investors in the world. Before SLJ, Stephen was global currency strategist at Morgan Stanley, and he created the Dollar Smile framework, which have been applied by many economists. And we are also joined by Matt Jones, head of distribution at Eurizon SLJ. So a lot going on in the global macro front, and we want to share those thoughts. And if you have any question, please send through Q&A function or email to us. So Stephen, Matt, thank you so much again, and please let's discuss the what's going on in the macro and the markets.
Thanks very much, Esteban, for the introduction. Thanks, Camila, for the invitation. Let's try to have a very interesting discussion, and I'm going to make the assumption at the outset that all the listeners already know the basic discussion points about the general issues: Trump, what's priced in the market, what are the Trump trades, inflation trends, the European slowdown, Germany, and China, the troubles plaguing China. So what I thought that I would do is to focus on a few, I think, interesting points, just to lay on top of your basic knowledge, if that's all right. As Esteban said, stop me if you have a question, send a questioning, or just raise your hand, and we'll address the question right on the spot. If not, we wait until the end. So in my talk, I'm going to present 10 slides, maybe 10. We'll see how it goes. 10 slides and these are 10 ideas. They will touch on the Trump trades. They will touch on the fiscal trajectories in the U.S. and elsewhere. They will touch on China and global trade. So Matt is driving the slides. Matt, please, can we go to slide number 1? Okay, this is the first point is about U.S. And global disinflation. We sort of know the story that the blue line is the United States CPI year on year. The gray line is G20 ex-US. Now, I know that we think that in the US, inflation was caused by fiscal stimulus, excessive fiscal stimulus. That's true. We know that in Europe, inflation was caused by the Ukraine war, right? But look how similar the two curves look. They look identical. they're offset by 6 months, but they look identical. So I would actually argue that even though the causes that I mentioned are true, the common cause is the same. It's the supply side constraint. That's why the curves look so similar. And a year ago or a year and a half ago, I proposed the idea. This is the US inflation math. 8 equals 5 plus 3. You see point number 4 here. 8 equals 5 plus 3. What it meant was that the overall inflation of 8% is the sum of supply-driven inflation, maybe 5%, plus 3% demand-driven inflation. We've gone through the fast disinflation part. 5% is gone, basically. You can see the blue line coming down so fast. We are trying to wring out the extra 1% of the 3% to get to the 2%. I honestly, I don't know why the market is so still so worried about inflation. If I look at these two lines, they're basically touching the 2% mark. I don't understand the angst in the market. The Fed and the ECB should be cutting rates, in my humble opinion. We're going to undershoot this 2% if the central banks don't start soon enough. Slide number 2, please. So slide number 2 raises I think we go one layer deeper. So what the slide I showed you just now is about headline inflation, but headline inflation hides something extraordinarily interesting. The two charts on the left, again, show you U.S. inflation and someone else's inflation, the Eurozone, this time, not G20, but they're similar. But the chart above is, on the left, is goods price inflation. It's actually gone to 0 for the Eurozone and actually negative for the United States. The chart at the bottom is services inflation. So when people talk about price stickiness, they're talking about the service sector price stickiness. Now, why is that? I will show you the chart in the middle takes one step forward in that investigation. Now, this is based on the United States data, 25 years of data. We use what's called the ISLM model, which includes output inflation, interest rates, and exchange rates. And we model the US economy using this framework, and we impose a shock, interest rate shock, to the system, and to see what happens to the manufacturing sector in black and what happens to the service sector in blue. And what we see is that in response to a 1% shock in interest rates, the manufacturing sector or the goods sector really takes a hit, whereas virtually nothing happens to the service sector. So this is absolutely stunning because 50 years ago, the US goods market was about the same size as the US services sector. Now the ratio is 1 to 3. The service sector is 3 times as large as the goods sector in the United States. So you can imagine monetary policies, if this chart is valid, monetary policies actually don't have that much traction in the economy. Interest rate hikes don't really do much. Interest rates cuts don't do much to the service sector, but they really affect the goods sector. Now, it's not just the U.S. manufacturing sector that's getting hurt, and inflation in this sector, of course, is low. For that reason, demand is killed for goods. But if you translate this to Europe, you might also have interesting ideas as to why Germany is lagging behind. Germany has the highest goods to GDP ratio in Europe. So if the goods sector is most sensitive to interest rate hikes, we shouldn't be surprised that Germany is really struggling among all the economies, and the peripheral countries like Greece, Italy, Spain, that usually never perform well against Germany, now actually outperforming Germany. One reason is that Germany is responding to the ECB's rate hikes. ECB must cut rates. Okay, as a conclusion. Slide number 3. Slide number 3 is a little complicated. The point is very simple. I think a lot of people think that one of the Trump trades is that Trump is going to cut taxes. He's going to let the 2017 tax cuts, which were scheduled to sunset in 2025, he's going to postpone this sunsetting. He's going to cut the capital gains tax. He's going to cut the corporate tax from 21% currently to 15%. He's going to zero out the tax on tips, zero out overtime tax wages, and zero out Social Security taxes. So that we know. So And that is why most, if not all, I haven't seen one analyst made a contrary point. All the analysts are saying that Trump 2.0 is going to be accompanied by fiscal stimulus and worse fiscal deficits because of these massive tax cuts. But what about expenditure cuts? All we see in the news are about expenditure cuts these days, not tax cuts. And um, Elon Musk has already suggested that $2 trillion could be cut from the US budget. Of course, 2 trillion is a big number. The whole budget of the United States at the federal level is 6.75. So 2 trillion is about 30%. 30% is equivalent to about the non-interest discretionary spending of the United States, including the military, schools, transportation, and things that the government can decide. The government has discretion on, and that's 30%. So it's very difficult to cut 30%. But Elon Musk often exaggerates, on the timing, magnitude, but eventually he delivers. So if we assume that in 4 years' time, the spending can be cut by 1 trillion a year, down, like a linear cut down to 1 trillion a year, we could actually achieve almost a balanced budget by the end of the Trump 2.0 term. So we think the point here is that we think Trump 2.0 has a higher chance of adopting a small government posture to cut both taxes and expenditures. It's not necessarily a deficit inducing. If anything, it's going to mean some mild fiscal consolidation to assist the Fed's efforts in guiding the economy slower and wring the inflationary pressures completely out of the system. Next slide.
Stephen, we have one question from the audience is on the inflation. Perhaps we should touch this before.
Yeah, go
The
ahead.
question goes like this: aren't you worried that goods inflation in US could accelerate because the comparative basis next year are much lower than this year?
No. It's a good question. The base effect is important. But the key here in my answer to you is that international goods prices are extremely low, and they're still falling. Chinese factory gates prices have been negative for 2 years. They continue to fall. It's not just negative on a year-on-year basis. They on the month-on-month basis they continue to fall. So and also the same goes for most of the Asian exports. The dollar is strong. That adds to the issue. It's not a problem. It's actually a good thing. I think that actually, if we think about it, if it weren't for the troubles in China that have led to disinflation, excess production in China, I think inflation will come down much slower in Europe and the US than we have seen. So China has given the world a disinflationary tailwind, and goods prices will be well anchored, in my opinion, and helping the world to disinflate. Um, Goods price reaccelerating is quite less likely. You know what, Matt? Can you go back to that chart? That's let me just make sure I address this right in a convincing way. Go back one more. So slide number 2 shows that it doesn't go back far enough, but if you look at the left side, the 2-3 years before the pandemic, you can see in 2019-18, inflation in goods was very low. In fact, if you go back further, it's not in the window here. If you go back further in time, you will see that goods price inflation had been low for many years. It's not a is this is not temporary. This is in fact goods price inflation at these levels is the norm, actually, the norm before the pandemic. So we're just going back to the norm. Okay. Slide number 4, Matt. So slide number 4 is about how we should think about the U.S. relative to the world. I know that there's a view that the U.S. Has done very well. This is American exceptionalism, right? People talk about, and I think America is very exceptional, uh, but not as exceptional as the numbers show, I suggest. And that is because look at the cumulative size of the fiscal stimulus we've seen in various countries here in this chart. The U.S. has put in, since 2020, the onset of COVID, 44% GDP worth of stimulus, compared to half that in Europe, and Germany only 14%. So now we're laughing at Germany. Why it's growing so slowly? We have to actually ask how much of the GDP outperformance of the US was due to just fiscal stimulus, and how much of the equity rally is due to more debt at the federal level. So if effectively the US has done a public debt to private equity swap by incurring more debt, spending more at the fiscal level to stimulate the economy artificially by borrowing from the future. The U.S. has inflated its economy to make it look more muscular than the other countries for the time being. But this is not real. It's not sustainable. Now, I'm not saying all of this is not real. A Federal Reserve paper has made the point that half of the GDP growth in the U.S. was due to fiscal stimulus. So if you shave that off, you will see that the world is not doing so badly, in the sense that the U.S. has really taken off, leaving everybody else behind. That's, to some extent, it's the case, but it's not perhaps not as dramatic as what people think. Next slide. Okay, so this is a picture taken not that long ago. It was taken in June of this year. The weather was still nice in Italy. G7 held the G7 summit. Sorry, Italy held the G7 summit, and we see the leaders of the G7. I'm sorry to say, going from the right to left, Rishi Sunak had 16% approval rating. He's now out of power. Kishida, 16% out of power. Biden, 38% out of power. 2 weeks after the summit, Macron lost the majority in the parliament. His presidency will run for another year and a half, so he's safe, but he has lost power. And of course, Canada has the election scheduled a bit later, a year and a half or 2 years from now. But Trudeau has no support. He's not popular in Canada, and of course, you know the difficulties of Scholz in Germany. 18%. He's not going to last beyond February this year. So the question is why? How come all these leaders have fallen? We have never seen this in the last 100 years. And the reason, I argue, is inflation. Inflation is very regressive. Inflation hurts almost everybody, whereas recessions tend to hurt the people who are fired. I'm sorry not to make it funny, but really the 10%, 4 to 10% of the workforce who are fired, it's a devastating shock. But inflation affects 80% of the population, and from the bottom up, maybe not the top 10%, but from the bottom up, 80% are adversely affected. And this was why the election 2 weeks ago in the US was not even close, I argue. And this is a trend in G7. Next slide. I won't go through. I'll skip this. It basically says that real income has been corroded and eroded by inflation. Next slide. This is important. So we talk about the difficulties that China is finding itself. The economy is weak. Chinese exports are being blocked by the U.S. What's China going to do? What's the future for China? And I argue otherwise. I think China has difficulties, it's true, but its manufacturing sector has never been stronger. So this, one way to show this is through this chart. This is the hourly manufacturing wage chart in dollars. So common currency, you can make comparisons across countries. We have 2 bars per country. We have the light bar is from 2008, and the dark ones are from 2023. So you can see how the wages have increased in each country over time. The United States now costs $51 an hour in the manufacturing sector. BD is Bundes Deutschland, Germany, UK, Italy, Japan, Korea. You can see the list. Mexico is slightly higher than the cost in China. Then you have, of course, Vietnam being very cheap and India being cheaper still. So the point here is that with China being the number one manufacturer in the world today, it's very difficult to imagine any other country supplanting its position. Not the United States, not Germany, not the West, not the US. And if the US and Europe try to reshore, it will be extremely difficult to go uphill, to get water uphill. If anything, uh, you can have a change in production side from China to Vietnam to India. And as production goes downhill, to the left rather than uphill to back to the developed countries, what's going to happen to global goods prices and inflation? Still down. And that's another reason why I answered in the affirmative to the question on whether or not goods prices will start coming back up. And I think it's very unlikely because the structural trend is in the opposite direction. Next slide. Okay, some of you may have seen this or know the main point, but I'll highlight what the point that's interesting. So this is a GDP, PPP adjusted GDP chart. All the numbers in each year, they add up to a 100%. And again, it's PPP adjusted, so it's not nominal. So you can see the line for the United States having drifted lower over the years, and EU27 has gone in parallel. Japan, you can see LATAM flattish. China and Asia, India included, have been rising rapidly. We know the story. What is interesting is the box. The box is now and in the next 5 years. So my point here is that what 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 is exciting is that in the next 5 years, we're going to see the red line crossing the European line in 2 years' time and crossing the US line in 4 years' time. So, in a short span of time, we're going to see the number three race car passing the number two and then the number one very quickly in quick succession. So, how are the cars one and two going to react to this? I argue that the European car, which is sitting in the number two position, will just let the number three car pass. The main reason is because they are aging. They were all former empires. Former, that's the key word. They're no longer empires. They know how it works. It's not their moment, and they will let China pass. The U.S. is a current empire. It's not going to accept this easily. So what they're trying to do is to bend the red curve, is to bend the curve to hurt China as much as possible to prevent and delay this crossover. That's why the trade tensions have heightened, because 5, 6, 7 years ago, uh, the lead car couldn't even see China in the mirror, but now they see China coming up fast in the mirror, and they're taking evasive actions. Next slide.
And this chart is just so provocative for any European and the US, because it's just the essence of all the problem that you already mentioned. But and you really need to do something that, okay, if there are more people in that side, that so you can pass it, but that trajectory to 2100 is just something that you can't really accept.
Absolutely. So I would even say, in conjunction with the previous slide with the manufacturing costs, I would say the only country that can stop China is China. I think only if China makes major mistakes, they can stop themselves. But it's very hard for me to imagine any other country stopping China because it's so established and it is still very cheap. It's not like Japan. Japan in 1990, when they experienced the property bubble bursting, they were already very expensive. Everything was expensive in Japan. Not so in China. China is very cheap, as you saw in the previous chart. And hungry. The people are hungry, hungry for success. Slide number 9 shows a derivative of the manufacturing cost chart. It's showing a simple point. The chart on the left shows Chinese exports going to emerging markets and those going to developed markets. More recently, we have just seen, and this chart is not updated, but more recently, we've seen Chinese exports to EM exceeding exports to the US and Europe. So we call this strategy K to indicate that China, the K having two legs, right? China is trying hard to preserve their market share in the developed countries, as people know. But what is not well appreciated is the lower leg of the K, that China has been very successful in penetrating their market access in the global South countries. Next slide, please. This is a slide to address people's concerns about the financial difficulties in China, and China is suffering some problems, some self-inflicted, some unavoidable, all related to the housing market. All I want to show here, and you if you squint and maybe later on you see the slides close up on your computers, you can see that there are 31 provinces and special cities in the bar charts on the right, the two on the right. So they basically show that there are good provinces, there are bad provinces in terms of debt to GDP. And the bottom chart shows the asset to debt ratio. You can see the good provinces, Shanghai, Beijing, and others, having very high asset to debt ratio. Now, this chart, the bottom line here is that we've done the analysis. We looked at the size of the problems of selected local districts, either provinces or special districts. The size of the bad debt problem is not small, but it's about on par with the European debt crisis. So China is basically going through a very difficult European debt crisis of the same size, and they're trying to digest the bad debt. They're trying to write off the bad debt. And what is different, the bottom right chart shows, is that China, being a communist country, the provinces themselves own a lot of SOEs. It's not just airports and toll roads. It's also actual factories, actual companies owned by the local governments. And this is why the asset to debt ratios are so high in these countries. The average asset to debt ratio across all these districts is 3.2. They have 3 times as much assets as they have debt. So that's one difference between Europe and China. But essentially, maybe the punchline, the bottom line here is that if Europe can muddle through their debt problem, why can't China? The last slide from me, next slide, it's just a point about China, Europe, and the United States. And the bars on the left show you the size of the so-called non-aligned countries in the 1980s. Countries that were not aligned exclusively with the United States against the Soviet Union, or those who are aligned with the Soviet Union and not with the US. So the countries that were in the middle. In the 1980s, there were very few. In fact, they accounted for the blue bar shows, light blue bar shows, that they accounted for only 14% of global trade and only 18% of global GDP. 46% of global population. That's in the 80s. Fast forward to now, the countries that are not aligned with either China or the United States, these are countries that are neutral, economically neutral. They're trading with both countries. They account for 64% of global trade and 44% of global GDP, 74% of global population. They're much, much bigger. And a key member of this is Europe. So my point here is that it's too late, I think, to isolate China. It's too late. China is so big that a lot of these countries that are sitting on the fence cannot afford to abandon China. So as long as China behave within certain parameters and not force these countries to abandon China, they will support China economically. And conversely, maybe the last point here is that China also understands that it's very important now that the U.S. Is now China's rival. It's very important for China to be friendly with Europe. So you will see, this is my prediction, you will see China using carrots on Europe, but they will be free to use either carrots or sticks on the United States. The treatments will be very different from Beijing to these two jurisdictions. I'll stop there.
So coming back to the discussion and the question, we have few questions already, and if you have any other question, please send us via email or with the Q&A function. So first question is on the inflation and the protectionism. The market believe that protectionism is as a source of further inflation, but you have argued that protectionism could be disinflationary power because it increased the supply of capacity of supply. Could you develop and explain how does that play out on the inflation?
Okay, I want to say that protectionist measures may lead to a number of possibilities. It really depends on what happens at each leg, of the chain effect. Let me walk you through one example. 2018, the U.S. under Trump 1.0 imposed exceptional tariffs on Chinese goods. Let's say on average 10%. Okay, 10 extra percent above the normal rates. What did the Chinese do? The Chinese devalued the renminbi by 10%. So what the Chinese did by devaluing the renminbi, they kept the export prices in renminbi unchanged. The dollar prices of their production came down by 10%. And allowing the US to add the tariffs of 10% on top of the lower dollar prices, and thereby resulting in zero inflation in the United States. So there was no inflation in the US, no impact on China, a weaker renminbi, stronger US dollar, they all offset each other. No effect. So in fact, one could argue that Trump 1.0 was not effective. It was not effective. It didn't stop China. It didn't hurt China. China has had to go through Mexico and Vietnam to export to the US, but they still did. It's not a problem. And there was no problem for the US either because it didn't create inflation. That was what actually happened 2018. Fast forward to now. What is likely to happen now? I think, and you could have a repeat of what happened back then. But what I think is most likely going to happen is that Americans saw this, what happened in 2000. They know very well if the goal is to hurt China, this is not, they're not going to do things in the same way. In particular, if they decide to levy exceptional additional tariffs on Chinese goods, they will make sure that China does not devalue the renminbi this time. And also, China being, quite having been in a difficult situation, general investor confidence in China being weak, it's also in their interest not to devalue the renminbi. When you push a currency lower, it shows that you are weak. In macro terms, you are weak, it validates people's fears, and that could trigger a snowball effect on equities and bonds and capital outflows. So the Chinese, I don't think, will repeat their strategy from before. Then you have a completely different story. Dollar renminbi doesn't go up, tariffs are imposed on top of the dollar prices. You will have inflation in the US, you will hurt the US consumers, and consumers being hurt will purchase fewer goods from China, and therefore China will be hurt as well. Who gets hurt more, the US consumers or Chinese exporters? It really depends, again, on the slope of the demand curve. I don't know. I don't know what it is now, but both will bear the cost, and this scenario will be very different from 2018, and probably, if I have to guess, a bit inflationary this time around.
Thank you. And we have another few other questions. First one is on currencies. Do you believe the trend of EM currency depreciation will continue, or before this scenario of a lower deficit controlled by US, lower inflation, and lower rate, we could see DXY or dollar index lowering and EM currencies recovering?
Okay. I think the dollar, I think 2025 will see a weaker dollar. Now, this is out of consensus. Is the consensus is looking for the dollar to keep appreciating? I don't think so. The main reason is because the economy of the US um, has a equilibrium exchange rate, one that they are comfortable, the economy is comfortable with, that is lower than where it is now. So when people like us, we do our fair value calculations, we are basically looking at the real variables and we calculate what the right level of the dollar should be. And we think it's about 17% lower, about 10 different for different countries, about 10% lower for the euro, for against the euro. Euro should be 10% higher, and against dollar yen, it should be much lower. Uh, but what is happening now is something peculiar. It's not that we never see this; we see this often, but we haven't seen the gap being so wide. Is that if you can imagine, there's one price, the dollar that we see. There's one price in the market, but you can imagine what I call shadow prices. Prices that are not shown, but prices that are meaningful conceptually. And I propose the following idea. For the real economy, the shadow price of the dollar is 10, 15% lower, cheaper than where we are now. For the financial markets, asset markets, the fair value or the equilibrium value of the dollar may be where we are now. So, what is comfortable for the financial markets for the dollar is a stronger dollar because the US equity markets are doing well, US bond yields are fine, attractive, US cash yield is attractive, and therefore the dollar should continue to attract capital inflows. But for the exporters and the importers, the dollar is too strong. I just showed you this manufacturing cost chart. A lot of that is coming from the cumulative exchange rate and also local inflation as well. So if anything, in the last 2 years, U.S. inflation, sorry, last 4 years, 3.5 years, U.S. inflation has gone up by 24% since the onset of the pandemic. The inflation in China, minus 0.2%. So there's a 24% difference in inflation. US manufacturing is too expensive. There are three ways to resolve this. One is to ask the US workers to take pay cuts. It's not likely to happen. Two is to impose tariffs so that you can protect US manufacturing without changing anything else. And three is for the dollar to weaken. So that's why the dollar wants to go lower. And that's also why people don't quite understand, but I understand one reason why Trump himself prefers a weak dollar this time around. because of where the dollar is and where their economy is. So if you think that there are two centers of gravity, one is a center of gravity for the euro, for the dollar, coming from the asset markets, which is where the market is at, and there's another one that's lower, which is the center of gravity for the real economy. It just takes the Fed to cut rates more rapidly, more in a more clear path fashion, that you can quickly lead to a situation where this exchange rate can fall quickly to the level, the other center of gravity, the other shadow price. So that's the scenario I have. It's very skewed to one side. It's hard for the value of the dollar to go up much further because it's already reflecting an outperforming U.S. asset market and underperforming world market. Will this get even wider? Not very likely, in my judgment. If the U.S. weakens, shows any weakness, as it should in a soft landing, then we have a problem for the dollar.
Perfect. Thank you. We have one more question on EM market and then few on China. Why have lowest quality EM bonds rallied so much this year? Have fundamental improved, or is risk not being correctly priced?
I'm not sure what the right answer is. We recognize the compression in the spread across different credit rating, credit rated bonds. It could be that we have collectively truncated the left tail in the world. So 6 months ago, 9 months ago, the world looked very scary because you had a distribution. Say the distribution for China, uh, the left tail was not small; it was pretty fat, right? People were saying, "Oh, you could have a repeat of Japan." But more recently, what we have seen is the government coming out saying, basically saying that there won't be any left tail risk allowed, permitted. So they did enough to truncate the left tail. Now, the center point of GDP is not much higher. It's either 4.7 or 5 for China. Nobody's talking about 5.2, right? So it's only 5, which is their target. But what's meaningful is that there won't be a left tail. China will not allow a collapse in GDP. Coming to the United States, we have something similar. We have had, not with policy measures, but the economy just does not want to crash. So back in August, there was this period, right, when people thought, when the July data came out, labor data, the market went from soft landing to hard landing, and then back to soft landing. Remember that period? So everything sold off, and so that moment is behind us because the latest data suggests that the economy doesn't seem to even want to soft land. So maybe the market is back to no landing again. Uh, so the left tail for the U.S. is cut. Now going to Europe, we're going to start to see data coming, becoming a bit better in Europe. In fact, GDP may go to 1.4, 1.3% for the EU. Germany may be weaker, but it's not going to collapse. This is as low as it gets. And next year, things will gradually recover. Income looks good in Europe. Consumption is trailing because, for various reasons, consumer savings rate has been higher than usual. It feels like it's precautionary saving, uncertainty driven saving, but income is growing in Europe. So the fear, at least in Europe, the fear of a recession is not there. That doesn't mean that the ECB shouldn't cut. If inflation continues to fall, and Germany, the economy I suggested earlier, that is most sensitive to interest rates, uh, I think the ECB should continue to cut, but the European economy should be okay. So putting this together, the biggest markets are not going to have a left tail. Then we're less scared about the ability of not too credit-worthy countries to be able to earn enough revenues to discharge their liabilities, right? They may not look great credit-worthy wise, but they will have enough income to roll over, to tide them over. So that's one logic that I can see that's consistent with the data that we have witnessed.
Perfect. Thank you. So in terms of the time, we will take the last question. This is on China. You showed the government debt slide, which you indicate they will probably do okay, just like Europeans did. But what about bank debt? In the end of the day, banks are owned by the same government, so isn't that a big issue as well?
Oh yes, it's a big issue. The calculations we've done show that the problems are not manageable. Yes, you have a problem. Everything is entangled with each other. When you have a all-powerful local government where banks buy the bonds issued by the corporations that are state-owned, so it's very incestuous. So when one province goes down, the property market goes down. It drags down not just the corporations, but also the banks. Um, the only straight answer I have is that, okay, what happens in a normal country when banks have difficulties? They get nationalized. Yeah, they get nationalized, and the central bank can print money and resolve the debt. Well, China is already nationalized.
Mm.
The banks are already nationalized. So that's, I'm not saying that they won't be paying financial transfers and pains and also corresponding moral hazard problems, because if the federal government bails out and the PBOC bails out certain banks in certain provinces that have behaved irresponsibly in the past to have led to the current situation, and you would have the same moral hazard problems as you did in Europe, in Greece and Italy, right? So China is, this is another reason people don't appreciate this enough. They're wondering where's the shock and awe? Where's the Draghi in China? Let's do whatever it takes to just solve the problem. Why don't they just solve the problem? And the number one reason is the moral hazard problem, very similar to Europe. Remember, the European Union in Brussels also refused to bail out these countries right away, Germany in particular. We cannot bail them out because they are bankrupt due to their own behaviors. If we bail them out, what's going to happen next time? That's exactly the same thought process in China. So, yes, mechanically, I think it can be resolved in China, uh, mainly because they're already state-owned. They can't go bankrupt. But number two is the more delicate one. It has to do with teaching lessons, psychology, moral hazard. Don't do it again. If you do it, I will really punish you. But is that credible? The local government officials might think, well, if we go bankrupt again in 20 years' time, you will have to bail us out again. They may think that. So the government has to adopt a posture that's scary enough to these kids, quote unquote kids, so that they learn the right lessons for the next generation.
Perfect. So thank you so much, Steven, for sharing your thought. Muchas gracias a todos por acompañarnos en este webinar. Y cualquier pregunta adicional que tengan, nos hacen llegar. Queremos dejar el canal totalmente abierto para que discutan con el equipo de Eurizon cuando quieran. Y ya compartiremos los slides y agradecemos nuevamente por su participación. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Steven, thank you so much. Matt, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for being here. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.